It's okay? Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I think we would be ready to start if that's, yeah, perfect. So good morning. My name is Fiona Ramsey. I'm the head of unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships. And I work in a unit that particularly looks at aid effectiveness and works on Team Europe. And I'll say a bit more about that later. I'm very, very happy to welcome you here today to Brussels, for those of you who made the trip, and to welcome our colleagues online, of course, who are joining us from all over the world. But it's really great to have such an audience with us today, and I hope we can make best use of this in-person possibility for exchanges and discussions. What I'd like to start today is just saying a few words about how important for us this conference is. It's taking place 1 month before the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation's high-level meeting, which will be in December in Geneva. And we really hope that the findings and results of the research papers that will be presented today and tomorrow will not only contribute to, but also really enrich the discussions at the summit, and particularly based on research findings and evidence from the field of how development effectiveness is contributing to development impact, or not. In the current geopolitical context, I think, where bilateral interests are becoming increasingly important to national narratives, both in development partners who provide development cooperation support, but also in partner countries, I think that we really need to make a convincing case for implementing and putting the effectiveness principles at the center of our cooperation and partnership activities. I mean, I personally feel that the enthusiasm that was generated from Accra and Busan has been waning over the last 10 years, which means less focus internationally. And I think we need to demonstrate that effectiveness delivers better results for partner countries, for communities, and that those results come faster. So this is part of the objective of the action area of the work program under the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, on which the European Commission leads. And the substance of our work here has been essentially 2 research projects. And the first project is the reason why we're here today. Was to stimulate further research and interest and exchanges on effective development cooperation, and to generate, I would say, greater visibility for the evidence that's out there, for the evidence that you're looking at, for the findings that you're bringing together. And so we've had this call for papers launched in the spring. The second project of ours looks at development effectiveness at the sectoral level, and the research team led by Dr. Deb, who's here with us today, has produced 6 country case studies and 4 thematic papers, which also, to our mind, will help contribute to the discussions. So while these 2 days are primarily about the outcomes of our first sort of work strand, we also will have, I hope, the chance to get some further insights into the second one, as we have the findings being presented tomorrow. Now, just quickly, I mean, if we put ourselves in the current context, current geopolitical context, where we see the sort of growing needs in partner countries that range from food security in certain parts of the world in a very urgent manner to decarbonization investments that will be needed to implement agreements under the COP strand, for example. And we look at the growing funding gap in light of the scarcity of ODA from development partners and the fact that as a collective this does not seem to be growing. I think we really need to think about being effective and efficient with the limited resources that we have, and that as a development partner, for example, the European Commission, the European Union, our official development assistance must catalyze larger development action. And if I look internally at the European Union, since the COVID pandemic, which was definitely a big shock and I could say spanner in the works, we can see that there has been, from our side, a real political effort, I think, to step up and to coordinate much, much better with our member states in development cooperation in this sphere of partnerships. So wherever possible, we're acting as Team Europe. We're working together to coordinate our financial resources and competencies on joint initiatives. You may have heard about Team Europe initiatives. This is essentially them. But I think what's important and underpinning that is that this coordination enhances the transparency of our actions. It should trigger more results-oriented project design. It should reduce fragmentation and help coalesce our collective resources, both from the official development assistance, but other resources and relationships that we have to support key development challenges in countries where we are partnering. So I think this working together as Team Europe has really become a part of our trademark. It's also how we're implementing the Global Gateway Strategy, which is the European Union strategy to deliver high-quality infrastructure in the fields of climate, energy, digital, health, and education. So I hope these exchanges and discussions over the next 2 days will provide us with a moment to really focus on what the evidence in development effectiveness is telling us. And by taking stock, I think we're in a much better position to look towards the future. And I think from our perspective, that's what we would like to see at the high-level meeting, look towards the future and to, in my mind, put development effectiveness back a bit more on the international agenda. So please use these 2 days to exchange, both beyond your institutional and geographical borders. It's great that we have the hybrid event, and so many of us who couldn't, or colleagues who couldn't travel, are able to connect in. Let's use this to start a longer-term conversation and cooperation that can, I hope, take the development effectiveness agenda forward in a practical way, even in these contested times. So with that, I'd like to wish you a very fruitful conference and hand over to Rachel. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning. So my name is Rachel Gisselquist, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UNU Wider. And on behalf of myself and Patricia Justino and Andrea Vaccaro, the academic leads for the conference, I'm incredibly pleased to welcome all of you to this International Research Conference on the Effectiveness of Development Cooperation. So this conference is a collaboration. I think it's the first such collaboration that we've had between UNU Wider and the Global Partnership and the European Commission. Some of you in the room will know us at UNU Wider, and for some of you, we are a new face. We're the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, so it's a mouthful, which is why we go by Wider usually. We are part of the United Nations University System, which is the academic arm of the UN. And we operate as, I think, a rather unique blend of university research institute, policy think tank, and UN agency. And we are based in Helsinki. I'm based in Helsinki. We also have offices in Maputo and in Pretoria. So for several decades now, research and policy analysis on development cooperation has been very much a core theme in our work for obvious reasons. And so when our colleagues at the Global Partnership approached us with the idea of this conference, we were thrilled to partner in this. The idea from the start has been to do this as a call for papers conference. And we weren't sure what the interest would be when we issued the call earlier this year. So we were incredibly pleased with the response to the call. We received over 250 submissions from all over the world, from junior colleagues, early career scholars, mid-career, and very senior colleagues as well. And from this really rich set of work, we selected about 80 papers that are presented here today, either in the panels or in the poster session. So we see the conference both as an opportunity for really high-quality research discussion, but also for engagement and exchange between researchers and policymakers and practitioners. And I think you'll notice that a number of Commission colleagues are joining us, especially as chairs and also as participants, both online and in person here today. After the conference, we will also be reporting on the discussions and the key findings at the Effective Development Cooperation Summit, which is held in Geneva next month. And we'll be participating in Spotlight Session 2 on the first day, for those of you who will be there. This is a session that's led, and the main organizer is the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka, and we were really pleased that they invited us to join them in the session. We're also very pleased that they're here today and that their team Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya and colleagues will be presenting tomorrow morning in session 4.1. So in summary, we have read your papers with interest, in some cases extended abstracts, and we will be listening very closely throughout these next few days. We welcome your ideas and your engagement on points to raise with the summit, and we look forward to talking with all of you. Finally, I have the task of giving some housekeeping notes. So first of all, I hope you all, for speakers, know when and where you are supposed to be speaking. If you don't, there are nice programs posted in some locations around the venue. You've also been given a printed program, which has a QR code linking to the full program that's online. For presenters, I think almost all of you have now shared PowerPoints, but I know that researchers are really bad about sending PowerPoints in advance. So if this is you, please make sure that you check your room where you will be speaking and make sure that your slides are there, because we don't want to be messing with slides in the middle of the session while everybody waits on you. Discussion in the conference is important. We've purposely not assigned discussants for the sessions because we wanted to have open discussion and open question comment periods with the audience, both in person and online. So please do your best to respect the time limits of the presentations as speakers, but also as chairs. Sometimes the chairs have to be the bad guy. The conference is organized in hybrid mode, as you know. So in a few of the sessions, well, actually more than a few now, there will be some online speakers, and there will also be online audience members. So we've asked the chairs to monitor as best they can the questions. I believe the questions will also be shown on the screens to facilitate this, because it will be might be a bit challenging to monitor otherwise. Some of the colleagues will also be circulating to the rooms to help with this as needed. The sessions, I think as you've seen in the registration, are going to be recorded. There are a couple of you who did not want to be recorded, and if this is you, you should sit at the far right as you enter, the far right of each room, so that you're not on screen. If you want to be recorded, please sit in the middle, where you will definitely be in view of the cameras. So we have a full day today, and I'm very pleased that we can invite you this evening after the final parallel session for refreshments and dinner. So please all join us. It will be in the atrium, where lunch will also be served. In a few moments, we'll turn to our keynote address, but first I understand that the hotel manager has some safety announcements to make quickly.
Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Jean-Charles, and I will be giving you some safety instructions in case of an emergency. In case of the emergency, please remain calm. The fire alarm will go off, and it will give you instructions in 3 languages: English, Dutch, and French. In case of an emergency, the screens behind me, they will go up automatically, and you can exit the meeting rooms through the double doors on your left and your right. Behind these double doors, you have a glass double door, which gives you immediately access to a staircase to exit the hotel. You go 1 level down, and then the assembly point of the hotel is on your right, just behind the hotel. Okay? I wish you all a very nice conference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I am obviously not Patricia Justino, who is scheduled to chair this session. Unfortunately, she's ill, and even more unfortunately, she's also lost her voice, so she can't even chair online as we'd hoped. So I have the great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker and to chair this session. Professor Anke Hoffler is Professor of Development Research at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Konstanz. In 2018, she was offered an Alexander von Humboldt Professorship, which is Germany's most valuable international research award. Previously, she was research officer at the Center for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. She is co-editor of the Review of Development Economics, as well as a research affiliate with the International Security and Development Center. We were really delighted that Professor Hoffler accepted our invitation to serve as keynote speaker for the conference. We note, and you'll see this throughout the next few days, that a particular challenge for development cooperation is effectiveness in fragile and conflict-affected states. And we wanted to spotlight this in the keynote and make sure that we keep it central in our discussions over the next few days. Professor Hoffler has done important work in this area, which has also, I think, very importantly, bridged the gap between high-quality development economics, high-quality economics research, and policy relevance. She will be speaking today on the topic, "Is aid effective in reducing violence?" She'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So I now turn to Professor Hoffler. Anka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this generous introduction and the invitation. It's thrilling to talk to such a wide audience, and let's get started. So you know the title of my talk, Is Aid Effective in Reducing Violence? And this is based on joint work, two different projects, one with Patricia Giustino, I hope you get well soon, and James Fearon at the University of Stanford. So this is meant to give you an overview. This is not one paper, but the work with Jim is forthcoming as a book with Princeton University Press next year, and the work with Patricia is also forthcoming. So is aid effective in reducing violence? I will talk about this in 3 blocks this morning with you. First, I'll talk about violence. Then I'll talk about aid. So I'll be very specific about the aid because you're the experts already, and then put it together and sort of talk a little bit about what I think aid can do to reduce violence. So, as was already mentioned by Rachel, war is, the form of violence that's probably at the forefront of your minds as development researchers. So I've shown you some pictures here. Obviously, the burden is an enormous human cost of war, but then also to the economy. Very often infrastructure is targeted, and economic recovery after the war is an enormous challenge. So these countries face, really a dual challenge. One is recurrence of war, because most wars happen in places that have already had a war, and they face the challenge of reconstruction. Both challenges are interlinked, but you might need different policy instruments to achieve them. But I haven't given it the title War and Aid, but Violence. So violence isn't equal to war. There's lots of other violence as well. So this is a picture of a street in London where somebody was knifed to death. So homicides happen in every country. Then there are assaults, which also happen in every country. Domestic violence, and also violence against children. So if you sort of think about violence, how would you categorize it? Well, the World Health Organization has got a so the definition could be, it's a physical attack by one person on the body of another, yeah? And there has to be an intent to harm, because a physical attack could be a surgeon operating or a football player tackling another. Yeah? But this is not, there's justified harm and consent in these activities. Yeah? So very often we have to make value judgments of whether this is violence or not. And we have cultural ideas about what violence is and make value judgments over this. So if we want to categorize violence, the World Health Organization has already given us a quite useful framework. So we have the collective violence, the war, yeah, and then interpersonal violence, yeah, where it's sort of one person against another, and collective violence is groups of people doing something. And then we can sort of be more specific. So on the left-hand side, there are these different types of collective violence. Those of you who work with all these fantastic Scandinavian peace research institutes know this well. This is the Uppsala University is the market leader in providing data on conflict. So there's war between two states. This is extremely rare. Yeah? Then there's war within a country where there's a group that challenges the state either for the central government or to secede from the state. And then there are, so this is what we call internal armed conflict, and then there's one-sided violence, so one group inflicts violence on the other, and the other one isn't capable of sort of fighting back or doesn't want to fight back. So these are pogroms or massacres or genocides. And then there's non-state violence. Sometimes groups in a state fight each other with no obvious sort of state involvement. So, for example, pastoralists and farmers in Nigeria or Hindu and Muslim groups in India. That would be part of it. And then if you go to the right-hand side, what is interpersonal violence? So, well, there we have homicide. So this is murder and manslaughter, and very much depending on the country you come from, there will be rules about what is a murder and what is a manslaughter. Typically, murder is sort of planned activity, and manslaughter is sort of something that happens in the heat of the moment. But every society punishes murder really severely, yeah, everywhere. And then there's physical assault, sexual assault and rape. A lot of it is committed as intimate partner violence. So for women, men are the most likely perpetrators, their husbands and boyfriends are the most likely perpetrators. Yeah? So the sort of most violence against women happens inside the home. And then there's violence against children. Again, this happens mainly in the home. There's also violence against the elderly and the disabled, much of which is hidden. Yeah, it's hidden in plain sight. I said it happens inside the home. And so it's very difficult to get reliable data. And I want you to keep this in mind when I now show you lots and lots of data. So the data are really bad. Because we can't observe it directly. And so we have to sort of find ways of sort of collecting and sifting through victimization surveys, because that what people tell the police and what the police then reports the UN Office for Drugs and Crime is not very good data. Yeah, because in some countries people are more willing to go to the police than in others, depending on how trusted the police forces are. Okay, so I didn't talk in the collective violence about terrorism, because terrorism is sort of something that's on everybody's mind, but actually social scientists find it very difficult to define it. Yeah? And that, if you think about it, how do I really divorce it from civil war? Because a lot of, so the really high terrorism countries are Nigeria, Pakistan, Iraq. So these are sort of countries that have also got other armed conflicts or spillovers from other armed conflicts going on. And so a lot of groups use terrorist tactics. And also in the beginning of a rebellion, yeah, you have a sort of group of people around you, you're the rebel leader, it's clandestine, you fight the government. That's very similar to a terrorist cell. So in the beginning, it's very difficult to sort of distinguish between. And once, so if you're a rebel leader and you start fighting your government, the chance of overthrowing the government is very small. It's about 1 in 8 chance of sort of actually ending this rebellion successfully with you being in charge. And so if you're not one of the 1 in 8, then your military might is waning, or you've misjudged it and you sort of realize the government is better in fighting you back, then you might also resort to terrorist tactics. So it's very difficult to disentangle. But clearly, you sort of think, but clearly there are some terrorist attacks that are separate from civil wars. And yes, they are. And I've tried to filter this out. Yeah? Because if you just add the war data together with the terrorism data, you'll do a lot of double counting. Okay, and then gangs. What about gangs? So if you sort of think of all the bad things and violence, you know, a lot of it is gang related. So the United States have got a lot of, you know, there's a lot of research on gangs, but of course it's not just a US phenomenon, yeah? Italy has got them, and the UK and India, you know, lots of countries. So that's a group by definition, but they haven't got a political aim. So what are they? You know, they sort of sit a little bit uneasily between. And again, I want to make sure that I've sort of disentangled this appropriately. So I think these gangs, very often sort of street gangs, is quite a good way of thinking about it, because they're operating in the streets. And it's very often about turf wars, yeah? So it's about drug smuggling, drugs, you know, this is my territory, don't interfere. So these gangs fight each other. Or for example, northern France at the moment with people smuggling into the UK, so it used to be the Kurds and now the Albanians are moving in, so it's a sort of turf war. Sometimes the state interferes and sort of says, we can't have this. This sort of really questions the legitimacy of the state and starts interfering. So Mexico, war on drugs, yeah, 2006. And then all of a sudden the gangs scale up and fight back against the state. So this is then more like a collective violence issue. So we've got to be careful about classifying gangs. So so I'm going to sort of talk about some forms of violence that I've tried to get data on, sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. So severe punishment of children is against the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. So there are surveys that ask primary caregivers, so this is mainly mothers. Your child did something wrong in the last month, how did you react? And you can go from ignore, so it's all act-based, so people are asked, you know, how they responded. I explained something went wrong, I grounded my child, I smacked her on the bottom with my bare hand, and then very, you know, specifically different body parts and how the child was physically punished. And so some children are being beaten repeatedly with an implement. Americans have a paddle for this. Other people use canes, belts, chains. Some parents threaten their children with weapons, burn or scold them. So when I talk about severe physical punishment, I don't mean a smack or a spank. Yeah? To my mind, this is also violence against children. It is very harmful. There's plenty of psychological evidence that shows this. But in order to get more buy-in, I sort of looked only consider in the main bulk of my research the severe physical punishment. Because when you look, for example, at the African Union, there's some chastisement of children is still allowed, yeah? And it varies considerably also what we consider as childhood and what we consider the rights of parents varies greatly across the world. Many cultures make modifications on their children's genitals. So, is this violence? Yeah, this is harm. But they do it for reasons that are culturally, to fit in culturally. So, boys' circumcision. Yeah, there's no medical reasons for the vast majority of these cases. But is this such a something that... So we decided we would not consider this as violence. But, this is one of these sort of very difficult borderline cases when you research violence. We did decide, though, that female genital mutilation or cutting is something that we consider as violence because it's got such the physical consequences for the girls and women are enormous. Yeah. Okay, so we decided, yes, that we would count that in. Early marriage. Again, the UN sees anybody under 18 as a child. But if in many cultures I sort of said this 17-year-old shouldn't be married, that would be very much out of step for that culture. Yeah? Also, when we as academics go around and sort of do surveys, typically from 16 years old, we sort of assume that they can consent, and that we don't need parental consent to sort of ask them because they deal with most of their sort of day-to-day life and make the most decisions. So what is really early marriage? Is this a problem? So this is statutory rape. So we consider this as violence. What about the boys? Should we sort of consider them as rape victims here? Well, on the whole, so we haven't got data on boys' early marriage. And typically they tend to be older, about 5 years older, where we do have good enough data for countries. So again, you can make up your own mind how you would draw the line here, but we drew it for marriage under 15, before the age of 15. Missing females. So Amartya Sen sort of coined this expression. So we know that in a lot of countries there are many more boys now or men in one cohort than women. And this is down to either femicide or neglect of the girl child. So she falls in and I don't get medical care because I sort of focus my medical, my resources on my boy child because, for cultural reasons, the name of the family, inheritance, funeral rites and so on can very often only be done by men. So there's a sort of value attached to boys. And then, of course, there is ultrasound technology now available to see whether the fetus is female or male, and and there are many more abortions now of female fetuses. Some of you might think that this is violence. We again decided, so the femicides are going to be part of the homicides. But the abortions is not something that we consider in our violence research because we only focus on the born life and not the unborn life. The elderly. So most societies are now aging and it's a really important issue. Unfortunately, we've got no internationally comparable data. So the elderly are mistreated either in their own home or in institutional care. And the abuse happens by staff, but also by other patients in the facilities. But just like with children, it's very difficult to ask them because very often they haven't got the agency, the capacity, they're demented to sort of tell you what's been happening with them. So it's an important but particularly difficult area to research. Violence against minorities, so for example, religious and ethnic groups we definitely have in the collective violence, and then sort of if you are being attacked because due to racism or because you belong to the LGBTQ plus community, very prone to attacks, violence against them. We haven't got specific data on this, yeah? I have to be clear about this. The disabled, again, this is a very vulnerable group that experience a lot of violence, but we haven't got specific data. And then, if you remember the definition I gave you on violence is one person on the body of another. But what about self-harm? Yeah? So self-harm is highly prevalent, and I don't know whether you've seen the book by Angus Deaton and his wife Anne Casey on deaths of despair in the United States. It's a very, very good read, I think, very sobering read. I can't say I enjoyed it, but it's a really eye-opening thing. So suicide is typically something we sort of think, yeah, somebody puts a gun to their head, jumps off a bridge. It's a sort of sudden event. But what about the many people who take drugs or alcohol and die of cirrhosis of the liver? So these sort of slow deaths of despair. And Angus and Anne sort of say, okay, well, you don't really want to distinguish between this, we just sort of put them together. For the United States, we have data, but for other countries, we don't. Okay, and then of course you can think of all sorts of other violence that I haven't talked about. Violence against the environment, yeah? Violence against animals, structural violence that really disadvantages certain groups in society. This is not what I'm going to, not able to talk about, yeah? And get data. So now let's go to the bad data, yeah? So this is about small and big phenomena. So this is about the relative sizes here, not the precise numbers. So this is World Health Organization data, and so about 80,000 people a year die in collective violence. Yeah, these are the wars and armed conflicts. And so about just under 500,000 people die of homicide, and then more than both of these categories together kill themselves. So it's a huge global problem. And the bars have got two shades of blue. The darker blue are men, and you can immediately see deaths, yeah? Violent deaths are predominantly a male issue. So these were absolute numbers, and then we sort of, since the pandemic, everybody can do this, per 100,000. Yeah? So how many people die per 100,000 in different areas due to armed conflict? And of course, no surprise, the really big bar at the bottom is the Middle East and North Africa. Okay, and there we've got almost 6 people killed per 100,000. The West really hasn't got these. I mean, you can slice and dice the data differently. You can do this by income, but basically, the poorer regions have got more violence. Yeah? Sub-Saharan Africa is another one where armed conflict fatalities are really high. So what about But keep in mind, this is really punctual, sort of like it's not spread across the globe. There's certain countries that have got armed conflict, but every country has got homicides. So this is the sad list of the countries that are particularly violent. So in the first column, you see the rates per 100,000, and then I've also put the counts up. And if you go down the list, this is all Latin America, Caribbean, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah? So when you've got a homicide rate of 10 per 100,000, then the World Health Organization says this is of epidemic proportions. Yeah? But these countries are far higher. Give you a category of comparison. Germany has got about 1 per 100,000, and the United States 5 per 100,000. These are data from 2015. I like 2015 because there are sort of many comparable data sources. The homicide rate has gone up in the United States since then, yeah? But just to give you an idea, because very often the United States dominate the media and you think is a really dangerous place, but in comparison to these sort of really highly violent countries, this is not that big. Maybe if you prefer to think in absolute numbers, in Brazil in that year, we had over 55,000 homicides. And Syria had a really bad year and this is no exception for Brazil. This is a pretty typical year for Brazil, but in a really bad civil war year in Syria, we had 45,000 people. So if you think about it, what do I see in the media? It's the Syrias. It's not so much the Brazils. So homicides by region then, it's no surprise given the previous table, Latin America and the Caribbean are sort of really, a big outlier here, much more violent, and then followed by Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not going to go through all the different types of violence. I'll just sort of pick out a few. So intimate partner violence, first of all, you should notice that my scale is completely different. Yeah? So these are non-lethal assaults, sexual and physical assaults against women by their intimate partners that we know about from victimization surveys. Now, there's of course also female on male violence, and also your intimate partner might not be heterosexual, but we haven't got data for this globally, and I'm happy to talk more about the female on male violence in the Q&A. So again, same pattern here. It's the poorer regions of the world that have got much higher prevalence rates. And then the severe physical punishment, remember the beatings with an implement and hitting around the head. Sub-Saharan Africa, much higher. Keep in mind, these are not the children that were asked, but their caregivers. And of course, when you ask caregivers, you have to take this with a huge grain of salt, because in certain countries, this is very taboo to talk about, and people will under-report. But there's maybe quite good reason to think that in some countries, people report relatively truthfully because it's a normative experience. It's part of a child's upbringing. Okay, and then percentage of women married at 15. So we start with the older women. So in household surveys, in the demographic and health surveys, women are asked, when were you married? And the older ones are to the left, to the origin, and then younger younger women to the. So there's some regions where this isn't very prevalent. So but then we've got South Asia, where these rates are high. But there's reason for hope, because the older women were much more likely to be married at 15 than women today. So there's a downward, it's not a time series analysis, but you can sort of think a little bit about it like this. So, and in Africa, this is also quite widely practiced, being married before 15. This is, of course, related to a lot of other bad stuff. These women are much more likely to have less education, more children than they wanted. They're more likely to be subjected to intimate partner violence, and they are unable to fulfill their full potential. Giving birth as a teenager is also a really bad idea, especially when you're malnourished, because then terrible birth complications can happen. They're much more prevalent in places like Ethiopia, for example. I'm just picking Ethiopia, but there are other examples where girls are left with fistula, with double incontinence, with terrible tearing. They don't get the medical attention that they need. They are shunned by their husbands and by their communities. It's really terrible. So suicide, you make up your mind whether you want to consider it as violence or not. Here, the pattern is very different. Look at the big bar. This is the West and Eastern Europe. So again, data are really bad. Yeah, when is a suicide a suicide? I mean, the Lancet has got really quite a few papers on suicides in India. Are these women being killed by their families by their in-laws over dowry disputes, or do they kill themselves? It's very difficult to decide. Probably these are underestimates, if anything. But this is an interesting, different pattern, and there might be reasons why the pattern is so very different. So maybe in democracies, people internalize grievances more because they can voice themselves better politically in a non-violent way, whereas in authoritarian regimes, maybe the sort of violence is more against the other. But there's not that much work on it, really. So the burden of violence, if you think about the burden of violence, you might come from a sort of school of public health where you have an ecological model, where you sort of say, of course, this is really bad for the individual. Yeah, I've just given you a few examples. It's also bad for your community, because if you hit your child and the child is then, sort of running away from home and engaging in early inappropriate sexual relationships. This has got, STD and HIV/AIDS complications in many parts of the world, and this affects the community as an example. To the society at large, these people are never going to be fulfilling their potential. They're not going to be as productive, and then also global. Yeah, so if you've got violence in a community, this generates refugee problems and affects people in places much further afield. But you can also think of this sort of intergenerational consequences. Yeah, so you can sort of think during pregnancy, women are at particular risk of receiving, at the receiving end of their intimate partner's violence. If anybody is an evolutionary biologist and could explain that phenomenon to me, I'd be most grateful, because I really, do not understand this. If she's carrying your child, why would the man then abuse her? So once the child is born, the child receives physical punishment. The parents are also typically in these families rowing violently. In school, the child will be hit, very common in many parts of the world. Then one of the main reasons why children drop out of school is because they experience so much violence. Earlier sexual relationships, and so the cycle continues. Yeah. So, okay, with Jim, I've estimated the global cost of violence. So we're putting dollar values on this. This might feel very uncomfortable to many of you, and I don't want to push this point particularly, but it should be coming as no surprise to you that with the high prevalence rates of interpersonal violence, less than 2% of the entire global cost of violence that we estimate are due to armed conflict. All the rest is due to interpersonal violence. But you don't have to, buy in on any of these things. You can sort of just stick with the prevalence rate. So if we then ask ourselves, what can we do to reduce this? Yeah? So many countries have been successful in reducing rates of violence. Homicide rates in the West have really gone down since the early 90s, for example. Yeah? Sweden is a forerunner in violence against children, completely outlawed in 1979 already, but there was also a historical process of finding the way there, and now much emulated by first the neighbors and then further afield. Okay, so I want to just sort of talk a little bit about how much aid is spent on violent prevention, and unfortunately I couldn't find any statistics on this. And so I'm going to sort of give you two different takes on it. One is OECD statistics on fragile states, and then the aid database from William and Mary in the United States, where we've got detailed information on aid projects. Okay, let's just start with the OECD data on aid to fragile countries. So what's a fragile country? Not all fragile countries have got armed conflict, but many of them either are in conflict or are post-conflict. Some countries manage to mess themselves up without violent conflict, but that's the minority. And you can sort of measure this in different ways, but basically you end up with the same result. So who are the most fragile states? These are in the Middle East and in Africa. Somalia, Sudan, etc. So we look at the total ODA to fragile states. So the different colors give you what, so this is for all donors, this is official ODA. So the dark colors are the not fragile countries, and then the OECD has got in the lighter blue the fragile and the extremely fragile. So the extremely fragile are the Somalias, yeah? Okay, and so from 100% you can sort of see that the majority of ODA goes to fragile states, either fragile or extremely fragile states. And then these bars give you the absolute values. So in absolute terms, the non-fragile get more than the fragile, and then the very fragile countries, the light blue. Is this different for different donors? I can, again, sort of show you more on this. I'll just pick out one. One is, this is the bilateral DAC donors. So this is what the pattern looks like for them. And this is for all the multilateral donors. And here you can see that the multilateral donors give more money to fragile countries. So the dark blue isn't quite as big as for the bilateral donors. But they don't give quite as much as the bilateral donors to the extremely fragile, the light blue. Okay, and then if we look at aid by sector, so in these different panels, I show you first the extremely fragile, then the fragile and the non-fragile ones. And the different bars give you the different sectors. And so what you can see immediately with the extremely fragile countries is this darkish bar. And the darkish bar is the humanitarian aid. Yeah? So obviously the extremely fragile countries just have enormous humanitarian needs, and these are served by giving aid. But note that also the fragile and the non-fragile countries receive considerable amounts of humanitarian aid. And then these sort of big yellow bars, so the yellow bars are the social infrastructure and services, and this is a big category. This has health and education, but also government and civil society, and then conflict and peacekeeping and security. And it's those two categories that I'm going to drill into for the next two slides. So first, I look at aid for government and civil society. This makes up about 8.5% of total ODA. And again, the different panels show you very fragile, and not fragile countries. And here we can see that I'm too short-sighted to see this. So the public sector and administrative management is one of the bars, is the yellow bar, and the other one are the legal and judicial development and democratic participation in civil society. With the fragile countries, these are not the main categories. It's a bit more distributed across these different categories. But look, the non-fragile countries also have a very similar pattern of aid. Yeah? And then I also wanted to look at aid for conflict, peace and security, which makes up about 2% of ODA. And the large green bar is civil peace building, conflict prevention and resolution, which makes perfect sense for those extremely fragile countries. And then we've got the removal of landmines and explosive remnants, which makes up also a large part. But notice that this green bar and that blue bar are also the sort of prominent ones for the other groupings of countries. Okay, so this is what the OECD gives me. What about aid data? So this is 1.5 million entries on aid projects and programs that are listed there. It's a fantastic data resource. Unfortunately, at the moment, it stops at 2013. Yeah, so it's rather historical now, really, almost 10 years on. If they have funding problems, I don't know what the reason is. If they have funding problems, please give them money because this is a really good resource. So you are familiar with these different sectors. These were bars in the previous in the previous charts. I've now sort of listed them slightly differently. They call it emergency aid, but emergency is basically humanitarian aid. So I filter out. I go through this enormous database and filter out all the projects and how much money is being spent on them, on this aid, on this type of aid. And then, of course, we have civilian peace building and security system reform. So we've got all sorts of different aid that addresses collective violence. What about interpersonal violence? Remember, it's so much more prevalent. And so filtering through, thinking of violence, police, sort of looking at all sorts of different word stems here, we find very little. Very little of these projects seem to be addressing interpersonal violence. So to summarize this is that according to what we've made of the aid database, 6.6% of all aid, of all these projects that are in there, are spent on collective violence, and far less than 1%, so 0.3%, on interpersonal violence. Okay, so remember what I've been showing you is that these sort of different types of violence so the collective violence on top is not highly prevalent, and the interpersonal violence is highly prevalent. Again, keep in mind these are approximations. Yeah, so just a refresher on violence before I sort of say something about, do we have to, why am I interested in this? Actually, not that many people die of it. Yeah, so there are other things like car accidents and infectious diseases that lots more people die of. Yeah, but I think it's not something that we should tolerate as a global community. We've made enormous efforts with public health programs on various communicable diseases. So think of smallpox. Yeah? In the 1950s, the World Health Organization says, let's get on top of this, and we did. And so as we make medical progress, I think, relatively speaking, the social causes of morbidity and mortality are going to be relatively more important. And unfortunately, there's no inoculation against it, but I don't think we have to put up with violence as part of the human condition. We can certainly treat violence, prevent it. What can we actually do? What do we have good evidence on? So UN peacekeepers get a lot of bad press, but when you look at the academic literature, it's absolutely clear they do what they are supposed to do on average. They prepare and keep the peace. 7 billion is US dollars is what we spend every year on UN peacekeepers. This is only 0.5% of global military expenditure. Yeah? Very little. Should definitely do more on something that works. And then there are sort of other ways of restricting arms flows, and we are sort of making some progress here. The reduction of interpersonal violence, so you have to restrict weapons, and alcohol and drugs is a huge problem. Yeah, many homicide victims have got increased blood alcohol levels. You can, of course, have legal restrictions, but if legal restrictions are out of step with local customs, you're not going to sort of get there. You know, you outlaw violence against children, but if you haven't got a change in norms and attitudes, not much is going to change on the ground. Yeah. And so I'll give you some examples now. This by no means exclusive, comprehensive. I don't want to be edutainment. So weaving in a story about domestic violence into a soap opera is a really cost-effective way of changing people's attitudes and norms. Young people tend to be particularly violent in their intimate relationships, and dating violence programs where dating is a concept that fits into that culture has been very successful. So this is basically 14, 15-year-old boys and girls are being taught about respect for relationships. Then something that I'm particularly keen on is to reduce violence in schools. So these teachers are in very difficult circumstances, teaching 50 a class or more. How do they maintain discipline? They only know one way, by a degrading, humiliating, and violent treatment of students. And mistakenly, they sort of assume, how do children learn if I don't beat them? Yeah? So exactly how all the evidence sort of goes exactly the other way around. Only in a trusting environment can children learn. Parenting, the same thing. We can teach parents about child development and alternative methods of education. These are well-researched programs, the parenting programs, for example, in high-income countries. We still haven't got a lot of evidence from low and middle-income societies. And then we also have to ask ourselves, these are all randomized controlled trials. What do we do with this evidence? You know, does it scale up? You know, how if it works in one region of the country, does it work everywhere? What do we tell policymakers? We need more multi-site studies, more meta-studies to sort of really hoover up the existing evidence. And I can see a start on this in the social sciences, but you know, we've got to really push much more into this direction. So I've got in my own research just two quick highlights. So this is a parenting program, Australian positive parenting program, P program, that's highly researched in high-income countries, and we've taken this to Kisumu in Western Kenya. And then this is a picture of a girl in Haiti. The partner organization witnessed this. She had to kneel in grit as a punishment in school, and the other children weren't supposed to talk to her. And we've got a teacher training program. We've just finished feasibility studies in Ghana, Haiti, and Pakistan, so very different countries, and we've been overwhelmed by sort of how open the schools are and also school authorities. So let me come to the conclusion. So aid spending to fragile and non-fragile countries are very similar. These patterns, the bars I showed you, are very similar, although they do have very different needs, so maybe we need to address this more. But extremely fragile countries receive more humanitarian and peace-building aid. There is very good evidence that UN peacekeepers keep the peace. I didn't talk about this, but happy to do more on the evidence on sort of cash transfer programs and these sort of community grassroots bottom-up programs is very mixed. So some good evidence that this helps us to improve governance and keep the peace in some places, but not in others. There's high prevalence in interpersonal violence in low and middle income countries. And there is plenty of evidence that we can actually prevent, reduce, and treat the consequences of this violence. There is, although I think, little support in terms of ODA to support these efforts in countries. And I think there is no reason to assume that aid shouldn't be as effective as governments doing it, out of their own budgets. But that is really something that I haven't got evidence on. I'd really love it if anybody could tell me about their evidence. So let me close on a key message. So clearly violence is a human rights issue. And already 20 years ago, the World Health Organization had a big report out as violence as a global public health issue. But as a community of development researchers, we have not as yet put interpersonal violence really squarely at the center of our research agenda, and I hope this will change. Thank you.
Thank you, Anka. That was excellent, and I think a lot of food for thought and discussion. So we have some time now for discussion and questions and comments, and I'd invite first the audience. I certainly have questions, but I give you the floor first. Who would like to start? Yes, please, in the front. There'll be microphones coming around. I'll collect a few questions. Please introduce yourself and then pose your question or comment.
Thank you for recognizing me. Good morning, everybody. Professor Hoffler, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. Learned a lot today morning, and both on the violence issue and also its implication of aid. I have one query, one interpretation, and a very simple question. The conclusion that the aid pattern does not change between fragile countries and non-fragile countries assumes that it was supposed to be responsive to the demand. But isn't it very well known that the allocative priorities are dictated by the supply side, not by the demand side? And so that is very obvious from that particular conclusion. Would you agree with that? That's one point. The second query is, you use the word donor quite often. So are we only talking about the grant-giving countries here? Also those who are providing credit. Those who provide credit are not donors. So I would like to make that vocabulary distinction, if possible, for you. But let me come to my basic question. Is it possible to go back to the slide where you categorize different forms of violence? Is it possible to go back? Because that will be useful to understand to put up my question.
Or can you do this more quickly from behind the scenes?
So it is towards the beginning, the forms of...
Yeah, exactly, but it will take a long time if I...
Anyway, coming back.
Yeah.
My question is, in that categorization... Yeah, no.
It's right in the beginning. Yeah.
Right in the beginning, second or third slide.
Yeah, there, I think.
Yeah, here it is. Where does the state-induced violence fall here in a non-fragile country? So the state-induced violence, what I'm talking about is extrajudicial killing, involuntary disappearances, oppression in the custody. So the question is there any empirical evidence the aid dependence of a country is directly proportional to low such incidence, or the other way around? If the country is more dependent on foreign aid, will it be more, the state will be more cautious about perpetuating that kind of violences with their citizens in that way. So I think that is, the presentation was very much focused on the fragile states, but I would like to take it to the non-fragile state, who are also receiving substantive part of income, low middle income country. That will be interesting to know. Thank you. Once again, congratulations. This is Deb Bhattacharya from Bangladesh.
Thank you. So would you like to answer that? Because there were a few questions there, or shall we collect a few more? Okay, so I think there's one in the front here. Please introduce yourself and your question.
Sure. I'm Nemat Bejan from the Australian National University. An excellent presentation. Prof, my question is, you focused on positive side of aid. What about aiding the violence? We have education systems being financed through different kinds of aid to promote violence. Terrorism is one of the examples in fragile countries. And also another example is refugees are being used through different training systems to fight back. So I'm just wondering, was it intentional to exclude that types of aid, or just as an exclusive research on a particular form of aid? Thank you.
So I think I'll give Anka a chance to respond, and then hopefully we'll have time for another quick round of questions before we go to the break. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think I agree with you on your comment on the supply rather than the demand side, and I think we need to make this clearer and obvious with data, and the data clearly supports your suggestion. Yes, I was talking about ODA, not credits, absolutely, yeah, so I should make that maybe clearer. So the state using violence. So one of the big problems that I have with the social science definition of terrorism is that the state can't be a terrorist. And there are clearly states that are terrorizing their own populations. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I should have really, this is really one of the big borderline questions on violence, because police harming or killing suspects is sort of something, that sometimes happens for good reason. Yeah. Being a police officer is a really dangerous profession. Yeah, a lot of officers get killed are killed on duty, but clearly some countries have got a problem with many deaths in custody, many deaths on arrest that are not justifiable homicides. Yeah, and these. So again, in public health, they are very good, the data are sort of beginning to sort of become better and better. We, of course, closely monitor the United States and other democracies where there are where there's a free media and information available, but it happens in a lot of other countries too. So absolutely, I missed that out. And then the education system. So the World Bank in 2018 in the World Development Report was on learning, yeah. So that a lot of so one of the SDGs is that every child should go to school, and in particular girls we should bridge the gender gap or close the gender gap here. And this whole big glossy report goes on and on what teachers should do, shouldn't do, and there's one mention of violence in classrooms. Yeah? I think we just haven't woken up to this. Oh, it's this, and it's preschool, and children aren't really ready, and so on. But it's not. There's no discussion on these sort of really fundamental issues. And I think what you were speaking to is very often, support in refugee camps. Some are really vast. These are recruitment grounds for for organizations, for violent organizations, and I'm not an expert on forced migration, but other people in this room are, and I think you're right in where you're going with this sort of questioning, but I'm unable to fully answer that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions from the audience. There was one question just in front here. Can you bring the microphone here in front? Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I'm Veda Vaidyanathan from Princeton University. I just had a very simple question because you spoke about interpersonal violence across cultures. I was just wondering, at any point, was there, could you maybe speak a little bit more about the individuals from these different cultures who are prone to inflicting this violence? Like, what are the common characteristics among these people? Because I'm guessing, while imagining solutions, while it's important to speak to the victims of this violence, I'm just wondering if, the perpetrators of this violence and their insights would also maybe point towards possible solutions. Thank you.
Thanks. There's been a question right in the front here, and then I'll take the row, not the last row, the one in the before that. There's been a question there for some time. Yeah, please.
So I'm Dr. Wasim from National University of Sciences and Technology, Islamabad. Thank you very much, Professor Anke. I've read a lot of your writings, and it's an honor to be here with you. So my question, I'd just take Professor Bhattacharya's question just one step ahead. In certain cases, we see that it's interstate violence, which is actually, you may not be directly involved in war. I'll give you the example of Yemen, but since there is no aid coming in, so the violence is going right down to child hunger and people dying of hunger. Same is the case in Afghanistan, since you don't like the ruling Taliban, so they no one is receiving the kind of aid they should be. So how are you looking at that kind of interstate violence also, which goes down to the individual level? Thank you.
Thank you. Second to the last row, there was a question in the middle of the row.
Thank you, Prof. I want to ask on the fact that, when you talk about non-state violence, one of the problems that we always face, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is the issue of internally displaced persons. Now, most of the violence tends to happen in IDP camps. So, in your work, does that include, most of this violence, does that include internally displaced persons, and how violence can be reduced in those places? Because most violence in internally displaced persons, displaced camps, you see, you find they are unaccountable. And because UN and other world organizations are barred from going into, because it's an internal affair, so you find it difficult for data to come out from there. So how does, your work, how does it cover some of these aspects to ensure that violence is being reduced among internally displaced persons? Thank you.
Thanks. I think we have time for one final question in the last row here in the corner.
Thanks. Hi, Amitabh Sarkar, the Global Health Center, the Graduate Institute, Geneva, and Center of Social Medicine, Community Health, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Thanks, Professor Hafler. It's an excellent start, set the theoretical premise for 2 days. My question is that last year I had the opportunity to consult your work while working on World Bank FCS, Fragile and Conflict State. So the new pattern of this humanitarian and development nexus. And what I found actually that because of this, the aid concentration is shifting from the extreme FCS to relatively FCS, areas. So do you think that this new nexus or humanitarian development peace nexus, triple nexus, is going to affect also the violence? I mean, in positive or adverse correlation? Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question because we started a little late. So there's been a question in the back, the final row there. We've been waiting for a while.
Thanks. My question is about causality, and I'm wondering how you isolate the causal effect of aid on violence, accounting for other confounding factors, and by a similar token about reverse causality, how you account for the relationship, the causal arrow actually being moving in the other direction, where we see violence actually resulting in an increase in aid. Thank you. Bhavnani from the Graduate Institute.
Thank you. Okay, Anka, over to you. It's a lot to answer, but please.
Yes, thank you so much for your interest in engaging. I'm not one of these key speakers who fly in and fly out, so I'm going to be here for 2 days, and I'd love to talk with you over coffee or dinner some more. So if you're not happy with my rather short answers now, then come back, because I really wanted to come to this conference to sort of learn on some of the sort of difficult things you're asking me now. So the first question was about, you talk about the victims and the perpetrators are really important, because if the perpetrators don't change, how do we, where do we go from here? And so I think this is really important, and we've got to engage with this. But very often it's also not clear who the victim and the perpetrator are. So take a teenage couple who both have a substance abuse problem, and she, needles him, and he hits her, and she hits back. So this is very difficult. And I think just being, more respectful in sort of setting good examples. So the perpetrators in the 2 research projects that I'm involved in, the perpetrators are the parents and the teachers. And so it doesn't help to sort of say, you're a bad person and you shouldn't be doing this, but it's sort of like, what constraints do you face? What was your own upbringing like? This is all with clinical psychologists who've got very good programs where people bring their own perspectives to it. And this is also why they are culturally very adaptable, because we ask parents and we ask the teachers to bring in a lot of their own experience. But you're absolutely right. Then interstate violence. So the Yemens, Yemen is sort of like not, unfortunately, in the discussion very much. But these are sort of proxy wars, where either the neighbors or other countries sort of. So in the classification from the Uppsala project, these are all internal armed conflicts with international support. And you're absolutely right, a lot of these conflicts have got international support because you've got to finance the thing. Okay, so this is covered. Then there was a question on IDP camps, that most of the violence, I don't know whether most of the violence happens there, but they are certainly dangerous places, absolutely, They're unaccountable, you said, yes. So this isn't my own research, but what I read, I can only agree with you. And there are some really good publications on Kakuma and Kalobey camps in Kenya on community policing, and whether that is a useful way forward. And they come to the conclusion that the community policing, how it was implemented there, is highly problematic and didn't really help. So I think, unfortunately, and these camps are there to be for longer probably, this is urgent that we address this. Thank you for flagging it. So the aid is shifting away from general to highly fragile countries. Yes, but of course highly fragile countries are the ones that can make least good use of it. Aid is least effective really in these places. Yeah? They wouldn't need it if they were effective, well-governed places. The better governance there is locally, the more effective aid is going to be. So this is a sort of perennial problem that we just sort of have to make, as aid agencies have to make judgment calls on all the time and stay in a dialogue and an exchange. And then the question on causality. So I've really only presented a little bit of work here on UN peacekeeping operations. Yeah? So UN peacekeeping operations, we really think very hard about the causality there. So maybe the UN only sent, so you get $1,200 per soldier per month, yeah? And you get a lot of equipment when you send troops there. So it's very lucrative. Okay, but you don't want to get body bags back. So maybe they're only being sent to the easier places, yeah? And there's a selection problem straight away, but that isn't the case. So the UN doesn't send only, yes, we look very carefully at these sort of issues. Now, there's a big literature on aid and peace, and I'm happy to talk more bilaterally here, where people also think very carefully about these sort of causation, because if I send aid and the rebels manage to get the food aid, yeah, Sudan has got a lot of evidence where rebels captured food rations and sort of, you know, were they therefore able to sustain their fighting. You've got to be very careful, but yes, there is evidence that the evidence isn't very good that aid actually prevents wars and stops wars, is my take on that literature. And on all the interpersonal violence, I haven't really got any projects, or not many projects on that I could tell you about, but hopefully I'll learn more at this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Anka. That was a lot of questions and great, great cut into them. And let's continue the discussion over the breaks. I don't want to keep you from your coffee and from uploading your slides if you need to do that. So I'm going to end quickly. But for me, I think this was also a really nice a way to think about, how can we think critically and carefully about results frameworks as well within the effectiveness discussion. I wanted to point out that we were waiting for online questions. There weren't any online questions, which is often the case. So for you in the online audience, please do feel free to send questions through the chat in the other sessions. But thank you, Anka. It was excellent.